Welcome to episode 473. On today's show, we talk about the Texas abortion law. I then talk to Christina Dent about the unexpected casualties in the war on drugs. And we start everything off with a look at China's new policy of banning video games for kids. Okay, welcome to the Holy Post. Here's episode 473.
Hey there, this is Phil Vischer. Welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. I am here with Kaitlyn Shess. Hi, Kaitlyn.
Hi, Phil.
Hi. Kaitlyn's dialing in from Durham, North Carolina, where have classes started?
Yeah, this is the last day of my first week.
Wow. Oh, I can't wait to hear about that. Hold that thought. And Skye Jatani. Hi, Skye.
Hi.
Is there anything you need to do that will disrupt our recording? Like let the dog out, let the dog in, go get your tea, go to the bathroom, have a truck drive by your house?
Hey, that's completely unfair. I got up and got tea while you were singing West Side Story and trying to find your articles for this recording. So it wasn't like I was holding us up.
Okay. We were talking about, while you were going to get your tea, we were talking about how you're prone to just going and doing things during the recording without muting your mic or anything. Just like, oh, I'll be back in a minute.
I mute my mic.
And Jason Rugg is here. No, you don't. And Jason Rugg is. Hi, Jason.
Hi there. I disagree, Skye.
Yeah.
The one who has to edit the podcast and cut out all the weird clunking sounds you make as you leave.
Yeah, you can go mute yourself.
Oh, and now it's time for the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Kaitlyn.
So that's Skye's new t-shirt. Go mute yourself.
First he was silencing his family, now he's muting us.
Yeah, I want a t-shirt that says, if you're not going to shut your mouth, at least cover it with a mask.
Oh,
I like that one.
That's so friendly, Skye. You really have a way of welcoming the stranger.
Yes.
Skye. Okay. First of all, let's get back to Kaitlyn. How was your first week of classes?
It was good. Yeah.
And why did you make an I'm scared face when I said let's get back to Kaitlyn?
I have been kind of scared this week. It's scary being in a new place and not knowing what's normal. And I'm taking a political theory class in the political science department. Yeah. And let me tell you that it is like the weirdest experience ever to go into that class. We all introduce ourselves. I say I'm from the divinity school. Like the looks on people's faces were confused.
I bet that's,
And not because you're a woman, right?
No, that's fine.
Right.
It's just like, why do religious people don't like think critically about things like that?
Do they assume you're advocating for theocracy, that's your role in the class?
Well, it's kind of funny because the first day we were talking, this is a class on social contract theory, and we were talking about the divine right of kings. And every time the professor was like, people thought that God gave this right to kings, she would kind of look at me and go, or people thought God did that, or maybe, I kind of wanted to be like, it's fine. I'm not committed to the idea of divine right of kings. Like, you don't have to apologize.
We don't want to step on anyone's toes, Miss Shess.
Yeah. So it's weird being the weird religious person.
Yeah. Speaking of weird religious people, no, I'm not actually. It's been a long time since we've done a news of the butt, And I know Kaitlyn's mom. Oh, Kaitlyn, don't make memes on me. with your face. It is time for news of the butt.
And now it's time for news of the butt.
Doctors find ladybug living inside man's colon.
Just one?
Yeah, just one.
Just one?
Just what are you? Well, I don't even know what that means.
Are you disappointed?
No.
Why wasn't there a colony? Why wasn't?
Yeah, I kind of like. I don't know what I'm thinking here, but I figure if one made it there, like usually there's more than like bugs don't usually hang out by themselves.
Sure,
It's usually
sure.
like when you see one cockroach in your
Sure.
house, you know there's a whole
Right.
bunch.
If
Or
when
ants.
you see one ladybug in your colon, you know you've got ladybugs.
Yeah.
But ladybugs are cute, right? So this is kind of a cute story. Caitlin,
Adorable.
wouldn't you say?
No,
It's a cute story. No? Okay.
He had a bug up his butt. But it was a ladybug, so it made it more pleasant.
And all ladybugs are girls, right? There are no male ladybugs. Doctors performing a colonoscopy on a 59-year-old patient were shocked to discover a small ladybug crawling inside the man's intestines. So they had to try to theorize, how does this happen? How does it, because it was alive, so it went through his whole digestive tract alive.
How did they know it didn't, come in the back door?
I think that would be a difficult thing. Here's their theory. So they have a theory. They developed a theory. Okay. And this is I think this is really a public service announcement for everyone. Just something to be careful. They believe the ladybug probably flew or crawled into his mouth while he was sleeping. Okay. And because he was doing colonoscopy prep, which means you drink like a gallon of this crazy goo that completely cleans you out and like flushes out your system in 24 hours. They believe the ladybug was carried along in the gallon of goo, and so it was never digested. So, isn't this fun, Jason?
Loads.
Jason,
it's great.
Had a Cinnabon lately? Speaking of a gallon of goo. So the lesson is, Kaitlyn, I know you're young. You're not really thinking about, when's my next colonoscopy? That's not a thing that's crossed your mind yet.
Nope.
Skye and I are on the different end of the spectrum, so to speak. The lesson, if you're doing colonoscopy prep, sleep with your mouth shut, because nothing will get digested that falls into your mouth while you're sleeping.
Can I share a related story?
Oh boy!
Oh no!
Is it? Do I need to do the closer before we move on to this, or is it?
No, it's
also
related. It's definitely related.
Okay, tell Skye, what do you got?
Okay, so back when I was probably about 25. I was married, but I had a couple of my closest friends from college were still single, and they were living together. And they were over at my parents' house one day, and my dad's a physician, and at times performs colonoscopies, or he was at an age like we are now where he was having colonoscopy. So he was sharing about the stuff you have to drink that, cleans out your whole system. And my college roommates, they were kind of into different forms of competition with each other.
No.
So they started asking my dad, like, can you get this stuff for purposes other than colonoscopies? And he's like, well, it's not always a bad idea to once in a while just cleanse your whole system and everything. So
you can get it for colonoscopies or for dance parties.
Right. So they decided to acquire some of this stuff and decided to have a competition in their apartment where they would consume this, and the first person who went to the bathroom lost. And it was pretty ugly.
That's terrible.
Yeah,
that's not good.
They had a colon cleanse race.
That's not good. Well, it's the reverse. It's a marathon. It's like, put your hand on the car, and whoever lasts the longest gets the car.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that some of them may be listening to this right now. So who you are.
You know who you are.
Did they put down a tarp first?
And this has been news of the butt.
This has been the news of the butt.
Sorry, everyone. I feel like I have to apologize because, I'll serve up a story. I don't know what Skye's going to do next. I don't know. I make sure that my stories are all clean, acceptable for the whole family, and then
clean like a cleansed colon.
Yes, with a tiny, cute little ladybug.
I'm surprised that's not a greeting card.
I'm like that's or a Sesame Street song. I'm like a ladybug in your colon, isn't it?
I thought we were done.
I'm like a ladybug. Let's go strolling over the sea so near in your colon. Okay. Thank
Wow.
you. Thank you very much. China bans kids from playing online video games during the week. China has barred online gamers under the age of 18 from playing on weekdays and limited their play. If you are under 18 in China now, you can play video games just 3 hours a week and only on weekends.
How do they enforce that?
They require, you want to know how, Skye?
Yeah.
Because they're China. They can do anything. They can just push a button and you can't leave your house. They can, push another button and you have a different job. They can just, they hack the internet. They require the online gaming companies to put restrictions.
So it only applies to online gaming if you have some kind of non-internet connected game.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So in 2019, they restricted play to 90 minutes on weekdays and 3 hours on weekends for children. But now, 0 playing on weekdays. You can play an hour between 8 and 9 p.m. on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. That's the only time children in China can now play online video games, which is just another sign of how China is going to kick our butts. Because our kids are playing video games like 30 hours a day, and they're just doing homework.
Yeah, but isn't that also a sign of the nanny state? Right. This is what the anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers are worried about, that if the government can force me to wear a mask and force me to be vaccinated, next thing you know, they're going to tell my kids they can only have 3 hours of video games.
Right. Yes. But at the same time, when China's completely eating our lunch because the only thing we know how to do anymore is play video games, we're going to say, oh, maybe we needed a nanny. Maybe we needed a nanny in the state. Skye, do you think conservatives will ever say, actually, we would have been better off with more government oversight?
Well, that's the irony, is the line between government oversight and personal freedom doesn't run cleanly between the political parties, right? There are certain areas where conservatives do want more government oversight and others where they want less, and vice versa for the liberals.
Yeah, this is true. Kaitlyn, how many hours a week do you spend gaming?
0.
See, that's why she wrote a book in her 20s.
I will say, though, there is an acknowledgement there, like Skye was saying, of like, there has to be a negotiation between where you have freedom to do things and how the things that you have freedom to do impact other people. Like, the amount of video games that my next door neighbor plays hypothetically doesn't affect me at all. But on the other hand, an entire generation of children who haven't been well educated in civic virtues or the ability to think critically about things because they spend all their time on video games, not that that's the only cause, but that affects the whole country. So I don't know. You have to find the middle ground there.
Exactly. Well, it's we're talking about infrastructure projects, trying to get infrastructure going in America, which we just can't do because nobody wants to pay for it. China builds stuff like, boom, we built a new high-speed rail. Boom, we built the world's largest dam. Boom. I was listening to a show on infrastructure. China, between 2011 and 2013, used more concrete in new construction projects than America used in the entire 20th century.
Wow.
In 3 years, they used more concrete than we used in the century where we built the interstate system.
Well, what's interesting, and when you take a step back kind of on a historical horizon timeline, back in the 20th century, the argument that the United States was implicitly making to the world, especially during the Cold War, was liberal democracy like we have in the United States is a better form of society and government.
Right.
Because look what we can do. We can put a man on the moon.
Our system is superior.
Our system is superior. We have, amazing grocery stores and highly educated people and higher standards of living and the best this, that, and the other. And so it was this message to the world that if you want to be prosperous and healthy and successful as a society, you should emulate what we do. And China is now engaged in the exact same argumentation. But what they're saying to the world is, liberal free democracies are inferior, and a soft authoritarianism like we have in China is actually the better way to manage a society in the 21st century, because look at all that we are capable of doing while the Americans are storming their own capital and abandoning their allies in Afghanistan. And they have a whole generation that's addicted to screens and can't even, get out of bed. So that's the implicit message they're making. And it's working in many parts of the world who are aligning more with China than they are with the West.
Yeah, I've been moving my household towards soft authoritarianism, trying to model it after China.
Well, to be fair, most families are soft authoritarian. Most families are not democracies. We don't give children equal vote in decisions in a family because we understand that people with more experience, wisdom, and education should be making more decisions. And that's essentially what soft authoritarianism is arguing. Don't let the people decide.
That's a good illustration, though, too, of democracy, not just like a literal representation, but countries that have the kind of values of all human beings are valuable and your input is valuable and being governed by the rule of lots of people and having their input matter is good, are necessarily less efficient. Like there's just going to be times when negotiating all the differences that we have takes a lot of time. And it tends to be times when you decide that inefficiency is the ultimate evil that needs to be gotten rid of, that you end up trampling over people and doing really negative things, not just in an authoritarian state like China, but in the US, when we decide whoever has the most power goes, hey, negotiating all these different people's interests is too inefficient. I'm just going to wield whatever money or power I have and trample over them. Efficiency and taking in the input of lots of different people cannot both happen at the same time. But too often we think we have to try and make it that way.
Do you think, all right, for the three of you, you all have to respond. Do you think when climate change, if it actually, I mean, it's bad now, what we're seeing going on, but like when it gets, okay, this was serious. This is like we all have to move away from the coasts and we can't grow food anymore. Does that push us to cooperate democratically, or does it push us toward authoritarian leaders?
Probably authoritarian leaders. Most crises do. The latter one. Yeah.
If there's anything I learned from the Star Wars prequels, it's a crisis always pushes me towards authoritarianism.
And don't give George Lucas unfettered control of a project.
That's the storyline of the Star Wars prequels, Kaitlyn.
Okay. I don't know.
How do you think Palpatine became the Emperor, Kaitlyn?
To Kaitlyn's point, though, and this is Kaitlyn was absolutely right, though. This is an important point. In the United States and other liberal democracies, essentially what we've said is we are willing to sacrifice some degree of efficiency in order to value individual dignity.
Yes.
And what they've done in China is basically argue, no, we're going to put more value on efficiency and take away personal liberty and dignity to the point where, I mean, the Uyghurs, for example, are a whole people group that have been persecuted and put into concentration camps. So there's the extreme: is are we willing to sacrifice efficiency for individual autonomy and liberty? The question is, where do you draw the line? Because some would argue that America has become so dysfunctional and our political system so incapable of addressing the problems of the day. Have we gone too far on the individual liberty front?
And can you come back just a little bit? Or do you just go slingshotting around like, releasing a bungee that you had nicely tied down on one side of your car and now, oh boy.
I think the fault, though, is not that we value individual liberty too much. I think it's that our technology and our communication systems have finally caught up with our value of individual liberty. So there was a time when we gave lip service to individual liberty, but in practical reality, it was the elites who ran the country. It was the elites who had control of the media and communication and the political parties and the institutions of influence. And now, through social media and the democratization of technology, we are closer to a true democracy where everyone has a voice and everyone can organize and have influence. And it's leading to a degree of chaos. And on one level, we value that individual freedom, but on the flip side, it's actually showing the weakness of our system. And China's laughing because they're restricting social media, they're restricting access to the internet, they're restricting video games, and they're maintaining a sense of control and efficiency in their country. So that's the issue.
Well, that's a little concerning. Okay, that wasn't really our topic for today. Our topic, but write in, let us know. What do you think of our completely spontaneous expose on American democracy?
how it's the same as Star Wars.
Yes, and how it's the same as how are we headed for Emperor Palpatine? Palpitate? What we really wanted to talk about was what the heck happened in Texas and the Supreme Court. And, because clearly, I think it's fair to say, Skye, that Skye was wrong. His video about abortion was completely wrong. And in fact, all we needed to do was get a couple more conservative justices, and Roe v. Wade is over now, as we've learned from Texas.
Not exactly. Not exactly.
Okay. Can
like
you
most
describe?
things, it's more complicated.
Can you describe what happened? Well, here's David French has a very brief description from yesterday, I guess. This is just a couple days ago as we were recording this. Last night, in a 5-4 unsigned opinion, the Supreme Court refused to block a highly unusual Texas law that bans abortions when there is a detectable fetal heartbeat. But the short description doesn't even begin to describe what happened yesterday. The highly unusual law has led to a highly unusual legal result, and that means that a host of people are just deeply, deeply confused. So people are celebrating. It's like, yay, they didn't stop the fetal heartbeat law in Texas. So this is the Supreme Court that is going to allow all these fetal heartbeat laws to stand, which effectively ends Roe v. Wade. Yay!
No. Not at all.
Do you want to walk through why we're not celebrating?
Yeah, and obviously I'm not an attorney. I am not a constitutional expert. I am kind of reiterating what I've learned and read from people who are, including David French and Sarah Isgur on their podcast. So the Texas law is very similar to other fetal heartbeat laws that have been passed by other state legislatures, which the Supreme Court has then immediately stayed or suspended because they were flatly unconstitutional and contradicted Roe v. Wade and other established law.
Casey.
What Texas did that was different, that avoided that outcome, is pretty clever. What they said in their law was it's not criminally illegal to have an abortion once there's a fetal heartbeat. So there's no state actor, no police officer, no court or official of the state who's going to come in and indict you if you have or you perform an abortion. What their law says is anybody who performs an abortion may be sued by a citizen of Texas for up to $10,000 plus legal fees. And the reason why that's important, it's a civil action, in other words, not a criminal action. The reason why that's important is in order for the Supreme Court to intervene and stay a law or suspend a law, they have to be able to, the technicality is that the court is suspending any official of the state from executing the law that has just passed. So you could tell the police officers or the courts or whoever that you can't do this until we've had a time to review the law. Well, since no state actor is involved in enforcing it, there's no one to tell to don't do this, because it's every citizen of the state of Texas is eligible to sue anyone else who's performed or aided in an abortion. So for that reason, the Supreme Court had its hands tied and couldn't stop Texas from passing this law. And it means that they won't have a chance to really review it until a citizen of Texas decides to sue somebody in Texas for performing an abortion. And then that civil lawsuit can go through the normal channels of review and maybe eventually land in the Supreme Court, where then they can conclude this Texas statute is unconstitutional. So essentially what happened in Texas this last week has nothing to do with whether or not the court will uphold or revoke Roe v. Wade. It's just a technicality that will, at least temporarily, create a fetal heartbeat bill that's enacted in Texas.
Right. David French writes, why would Texas pass such an unusual law? The short answer is quite simple: to achieve exactly the result they achieved last night. So how did the Supreme Court respond? A short way of describing the ruling is by saying that the plaintiffs sued the wrong defendants. There is no correct defendant to sue yet because nothing has happened in Texas. No one has sued anyone. No citizen has sued an abortion provider. So there's no defendant. What does any of this have to do with the constitutionality of Roe versus Wade? On the merits, nothing at all. Put in plain English, this means that the court delayed deciding the main issue in the case. It did not decide the issue. It did not, no matter what you might have read elsewhere, overrule Roe, either explicitly or implicitly. And this is, there's been a ton of hand wringing from the left saying, this is disastrous, and obviously it does impact people right away. You cannot get an abortion, right now in Texas after 6 weeks. No one will do it because they don't want to get buried in lawsuits, which, and people on the left will also argue that affects poor women much more than wealthy women who can afford to just travel to another state. That's to a certain extent neither here nor there. Here's the Wall Street Journal is not liberal. It's owned by Rupert Murdoch, who also owns Fox News. This is what the Wall Street Journal editorial board wrote. They said, this law sets an awful precedent that conservatives should hate. Could California allow private citizens to sue individuals for hate speech? Could New York deputize private lawsuits against gun owners? So they said they've come up with something very clever as a way to get around the Supreme Court. But now that they've established this pattern could be used by lots of people on both sides for lots of reasons as kind of harassment, to shut things down and where the Supreme Court can't step in. So the Wall Street Journal conservative editorial board says a provider who gets sued under the Texas law will undoubtedly seek to dismiss the lawsuit under the court's abortion precedents, and the law will be properly adjoined. In other words, it's not going to stand. Meanwhile, Texas Republicans have handed Democrats a political grenade to hurt the anti-abortion cause. And then their conclusion from the Wall Street Journal editorial board is, sometimes we wonder if Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton is a progressive plant. His ill-conceived legal attack against Obamacare backfired on Republicans in last year's election and lost at the Supreme Court. Now he and his Texas mates are leading with their chins on abortion. That's not a compliment, leading with your chin. It's when you're a boxer and you stick your chin out to get punched, and that's how you're attacking. Yes, I know, Kaitlyn.
Thank you, Phil.
Kaitlyn, I know you're not well-versed in boxing metaphors, so I'm trying to help out. Their final request from the Wall Street Journal editorial board to Texas is, how about thinking first?
Ouch.
So if you've lost the Wall Street Journal, you're not doing conservatism very well.
Well, and beyond the copycat tactics that could be used by the left on other issues around the country in different states, the other factor that came up was Ryan Burge was looking at data about abortion and or pro-abortion and pro-life voters. And he talked about how pro-abortion voters are far more politically active than pro-life voters. So when you throw this grenade into the 2022 election cycle, it might activate a ton of liberal, progressive, pro-abortion advocates to get out the vote for their side. Yeah. So this very short-term kind of media buzz win in Texas could actually set back the ultimate goal of the pro-life movement long-term if the wrong people get elected in state houses and around the country.
And the fact that it doesn't make any allowance for cases of rape or incest sends the message that, this is what conservatives really want to do. Mm-hmm. They want to go draconian. They want to go all out. Handmaid's Tale. They want to, turn back the clock 100 years. And that is a really great way to fundraise for liberal challengers. Really. Okay, Kaitlyn, since you are taking classes in political science, I'm sure you've got a point of view.
I do. It's interesting because one of my classes just this last week, we were talking about politics very, very generally. Like, how are we defining this? How do we think about this? And we had a whole conversation about politics as the ability to negotiate between different points of view that is not violence or, just force. And when I first heard about the Texas law, my first thought was, you've taken this really controversial issue that is controversial in part because of how personal it is. Like, it deals with your deeply held personal values. We have differences of definition that make it really difficult for us to have conversations. And it's turned into an identity piece. Like, political coalitions are created around, you might have differences on other things, but we'll get you together whether you're pro-life or pro-choice. So you have this like deeply personal, contested, identity-based issue. And in a place where you could have prioritized persuading people to be on your side for if someday Roe is overturned and you suddenly have voters deciding what the laws of restricting abortions is in your state, instead of fostering conversation and persuasion by making it a personal, a civilian just kind of going out and suing someone for having an abortion, you've taken this controversial issue and further made it us versus them, me against my neighbor. Even if you never are getting an abortion or you're never, finding out that someone had one and, tattling on them, you're still having this sense of my neighbor who disagrees with me is fundamentally at war with me. And if I disagree with what they have done, instead of persuading them, I will harm them financially. And I have a financial incentive. I will harm them in some way, and I have a financial incentive to harm them. So it just seems like if the goal truly is both creating an ability for us to have conversations across difference, for us to be able to understand each other's point of view and compassionately understand it and compassionately understand the material needs of women facing the choice to have an abortion. If we want to be able to find areas of common ground on that with people who are in ideologically separate camps, we're not going to do that by further making it a personal fight against each other. And then pragmatically, if Roe is overturned and you're trying to suddenly convince the people in your state to vote for more restrictive abortion policies, how are you going to do that when you spent a couple months there where some of you had a financial incentive to tattle on your neighbor and some of you were walking around afraid that someone might find out, or, you would have to travel somewhere. There's just so much suspicion and fear and combativeness there that feels like it will preclude what will be necessary if you want better policies on abortion, which is pro-life people understanding the concerns of pro-choice people understanding the concerns of pro-life people, and finding areas of common ground where we could say, I really want to see life affirmed and valued. And we have different definitions of how that works. And so it's going to be difficult for us to come to compromises. But if I want to persuade you that a more restrictive abortion policy is life affirming and causes flourishing, and that I want to support policies that support mothers and support them financially and materially, like if I want to have that kind of conversation, which I hope the best pro-life people want to have that conversation, you are not going to have that conversation after passing a law like this that puts us at each other's throats.
Right. It doesn't seem like I just saw one headline that just said, what the heck? It didn't say heck, but I don't swear. Shh. What the heck is going on in Texas? And it's like overall, it's because 666 new laws just went into effect, which should concern us as Christians right there. I don't know why that's not a red flag. But including you can now carry a gun without any license.
Yeah.
You can openly carry without any license or permit whatsoever. So anyone can just walk around Texas with guns. It's like, where's your 6-shooter, dude? We're going to the pub. No, they don't have pubs in the Wild West. Going to the saloon. That was the word I was looking for, the saloon. Yeah. So let's, that's a little nutty. And then
without a background check. You don't even have to have a background check.
And all the voting restrictions that just came in, and you can argue for or against, whether specific ones, who are they hurting a certain class of people, or, do they affect everyone equally? But it just seems like I don't know what kind of social experiment is being run in Texas as all of Texas major cities grow more and more blue. There's still enough control, very, very bright red control of the state, that it's almost like, let's do as much as we can while we still have power and then hope it all somehow sticks.
The part that's so confusing to me, and this doesn't just apply to Texas, but nationwide, is on a lot of these very divisive issues, a huge chunk of Americans actually agree.
Yeah.
There are a lot of Americans who believe that abortion should be more limited than it currently is. There are a whole bunch of Americans, including the vast majority of gun owners, who believe in background checks and that there needs to be more enforcement of gun laws. And yet, on both the right and the left, it's the extreme partisans on either side that seem to be dictating the rules of the engagement here and what the laws are. So, like going back to Ryan Burge's statistics, white evangelicals are the Americans least supportive of abortion, and yet only 34% of white evangelicals believe that abortion should be illegal in all circumstances. Right. 34%, that's it. So the Texas law is more extreme than 70% or 66% of white evangelicals want it to be. So it's just kind of ridiculous to me that rather than seeking that large area of common ground of people who want to see common sense abortion laws and restrictions, they're going to an extreme, which is only keeping the fight going, which may serve their political interests, but ultimately isn't going to serve the interests of women who are in unplanned pregnancies, or the unborn.
Yeah.
Right. Charles Camosi, not sure how to say his name. He's a professor at Fordham University. He's writing from a Catholic perspective from a Catholic university. Wrote a piece called "Common Ground on Abortion is Staring Us Right in the Face." And he actually wrote this a few weeks ago before this all blew up. Says Gallup consistently finds a majority of Americans support legal abortion before 12 weeks of gestation, but that a supermajority want abortion mostly illegal after week 12. And that's really important, to say a supermajority of Americans want abortion mostly illegal after 12 weeks. And this was confirmed just recently again by an Associated Press poll. So though majorities say they support Roe v. Wade, they do not actually support the current abortion law in the United States, which doesn't allow for restrictions before about 22 weeks. Americans seem to want a much more pro-life abortion policy, something close, and this is a shock to a lot of people. In Finland and Denmark, you can't get an abortion after 12 weeks.
Yeah.
That's the threshold. Something close to the 12-week threshold of Finland and Denmark. So these are highly liberal, socialist, quote unquote, Scandinavian countries. The objection is that the U.S. doesn't have the social supports for mothers and families that these countries have. If we did, we could afford to have more restrictive laws. So he writes, there's an obvious common ground to be had on the demand side of abortion as well, the need to take care of babies who would be born to women who now choose abortion. Pro-lifers and pro-choicers should both want to help women and families be in a place to choose to have another child. So his conclusion is the only thing preventing us from doing this, from supporting mothers so there's more help, so that we can have more restrictive abortion law, is politics. Is like, because helping mothers, that sounds like welfare, and one side is against welfare, and then restricting abortion more sounds like conservative politics, and so one side doesn't want that. So, he concludes by saying supporting mothers is just such obvious common ground in the abortion debate, one wonders why it hasn't already been achieved. But a major part of the story is the way national politics has taken up the God-shaped hole in our hearts. As former Illinois Republican Congressman Dan Lipinski said, secular politics has become a religion, complete with sets of doctrines that may not be questioned. Indeed, Americans increasingly do not define themselves positively with a coherent vision of the good, but rather by opposition to the other side.
Right.
That kind of sounds like a book somebody wrote recently who's sitting on this podcast.
That's you, Kaitlyn.
Kaitlyn,
Oh.
I'm talking about you.
Well, okay. You know what was happening in my brain right there? I was still caught on the end of that was exactly what I wanted to say next. So I was like, dang it. The article took the thing I wanted to say. And then I missed the part where you were like, you say that sometimes.
You say that. Yeah. So no, Kaitlyn, run with it. Help us out.
Well, before you got to that point, I was literally thinking there is something really coherent with evangelicals having this very punitive approach to abortion and having a general pretty punitive approach to criminal justice, which is just like all the things I don't like should be illegal and you should be punished for them. And there isn't a sense of like restorative justice or a sense of a positive vision of flourishing for families, for mothers, for children. And that happens in all areas of our politics.
Yes,
like that's not just an abortion issue.
Kaitlyn, because families would flourish if parents did it the right way. And so we can't reward them for doing it the wrong way. It's really a very kind of patriarchal, paternalistic. It's like, hey, you other adults, you're my children and you're doing it wrong. So I need to make sure you get punished so you'll do it right.
Go ahead, Kaitlyn. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say the other part of it is not having a communal vision of flourishing. So if my
Yeah.
vision is just how a family should be structured or how an individual should act, then I can say, when it comes to abortion policies, women shouldn't get abortions and a family should look like this. It should have a mom and a dad and this many kids.
Mhm.
We don't have a sense of, if a whole community is involved in both the flourishing of individuals and the raising of children, like we have actually incredible theological resources to say a woman who is facing an unwanted pregnancy should have the support, not just, it would be lovely if she were married and had the support of a husband, if she had the support of her extended family, but if she doesn't, do we have a vision of her whole community comes around her, the church comes around her, and actually it benefits everyone if we have a kind of context in which a child could be raised that causes flourishing for them and for their larger community. But when everything is individualistic and based on a really kind of moralistic sense of things, like follow the right rules, that's the most important thing, not what does it mean for a human being to live a positive, flourishing life, then of course you're just going to punish abortion providers or punish women who have abortion instead of figuring out not only what causes those, we talk about that all the time, like why are women interested in having abortions? Let's address those problems of poverty and lack of resources, but also just like what kind of culture of a community do we want to have? I want to have a life affirming ethic for a community. That includes background checks for guns. That includes people being able to vote and participate in the civic process. And it involves people valuing the lives of unborn children and the elderly and the disabled. And if we don't have a positive sense of that, like the end of that article said, a positive vision of flourishing that says, this is what flourishing looks like, how do we reach that? Then we're going to be left with just like the really low bar of like everything I don't like should be punished.
To be fair, there are a lot of Christians, and including conservative evangelicals, who are engaged on the ground with women who are pregnant, with crisis pregnancy centers, with caring for families, with the adoption movement and the foster care movement. There's a lot of people doing a lot of good on that level. But there is something weird that happens when we take these issues into the category of politics and policy, where a lot of Christians just kind of lose their minds and they cease to think the way you're describing, Kaitlyn, and we move into this punitive us versus them reactionary kind of stuff, which is ultimately unhelpful. And that's always been what I haven't been able to reconcile, is why are there so many who do so much good on the ground, but then when they engage in political rhetoric, it completely falls apart.
Someone tweeted us the question. Said, please discuss. Apparently, Owen Strachan wrote an article about limited government. Why are evangelicals so obsessed with limited government? And that's part of it. Is like, oh, well, if you're talking politics, you're talking about government doing something, and we don't like government doing things. Because that's not the way it's supposed to be. The church is supposed to do things. Families are supposed to do things, and then there is the Catholic concept of subsidiarity that says, solve the problem as close to the problem as you can. If you can solve it in a family, solve it in a family. If you can solve it in a church, solve it in a church. But that's become that's become a religious dogma to be anti-federal government, that we've just lost the ability to consider solutions, and I try to redefine it with people, because people say, you're saying the government should solve the problem, the government is bad. And I'm just trying to push back and say, the government is us. We live in a representative democracy. We are the people, the government, so if you've given up on government, you've given up on America. Like, you've given up on the American experiment. Is that really where you want to be? Because when we all decide to do something together, government is how we do that. And we've just completely lost that vision of working together, at the highest possible level. Kaitlyn?
Well, I think we've also lost a sense that the ideology of a really limited government, especially like a really truly libertarian approach to politics, isn't just the absence of a political theory about how things should work. It's a theory that says, under these certain conditions, this is how people will best flourish. If that is not happening, if that's not true, then reevaluate the degree to which you hold that ideology that is not straight from the Bible.
No, you want me to change ideology, which probably means you want me to become a communist.
Those are the only two options. Yeah. Communist or libertarian. But it is really, I think people are walking around thinking that the decisions that they have made about how they think about government are just either straight from the Bible or they're just neutral ideas. They don't come from anywhere. They don't have a history. They don't have an ability to like see what the effects of those policies are. And so the idea that like if you have a really libertarian approach to government, that's just like the absence of having a specific idea of how the government should work, that's wrong. You're assuming that a lack of government intervention in those kinds of things will positively bring about the best. I mean, that's the real kind of constructors of that ideology said this will help the most amount of people. This will help the poor. If it's not helping the poor, you don't cling to that thing for no reason. You figure out what's wrong with it. And maybe you don't jump to the farthest thing from that because this far extreme didn't work. The next far extreme will work. But you figure out what things are missing from that ideology. And you figure out how that ideology has impacted the things you think are valuable. Like your adoption of it isn't just, I come in with all the things that I hold are valuable, including protection and care for the poor. I enter into this ideology with those ideals, and then I leave and I have the same ideals. No, you've been shaped by that ideology, by the voices you've been listening to. So at the end of the day, you might think you really care about protection of the poor, and you've been shaped slowly over time to care less about that. And if you were to reclaim that desire to help people, then maybe you could kind of evaluate the ideology that you've been immersed in and go, it's not perfect. How do I figure out some better ways to achieve those goals I actually want?
Okay, but Kaitlyn, you're I agree with you 100%, but what you're assuming is that people actually care about solutions. And I've talked about this before when it comes to the abortion issue, and I know there are good people who genuinely do care about solutions and want to help women and see the number of abortions reduced dramatically. But I think for a lot of people, especially in the evangelical subculture, it's really not about solving the practical reality of abortion in this country.
Yeah.
It's about symbolism. And the idea that I live in a country, or I live in a state, if I'm in Texas, that I live in a place where killing unborn children is legal is so abhorrent to me, not because it's actually killing children, but because I'm associated with it by identity as an American or as a Texan, that really what it's about is purifying my identity by making sure that law isn't on the books anymore, because then I can feel self-righteous again. Then I can feel like my community, country, state is in good standing with God. Whether or not that law actually ends up helping any women or saving any children, it makes me feel better symbolically because it's not on the books anymore. And for some people, I think that's what this is about. And they think that if we just erase that law, or if we just get rid of gay marriage, if we just do this or the other, or we just get prayer back in school, then somehow God will be pacified in his wrath like some kind of divine toddler, and his blessing will flow on America again, which fits perfectly into a future chapter of my future book, How Stupid Do You Think God Is? So that's the issue. And I think what we need to do is move more Christians away from a symbolic understanding of these issues to an actual solution. What actually is going to help women and children and families and the unborn? And let's advocate for whatever legal policies or court resolutions, state or national, will move us in that direction. I think Roe's a bad law, and I would celebrate if it was overturned. But I also know it's not the silver bullet that's going to do it. Yeah. I'm happy if Texas is able to pass laws that puts more restrictions that make sense on abortion. I'd also celebrate if they pass policies that helped women, made adoption easier, supported more families, did other policies that have been proven to reduce poverty and abortion rates. But our symbolism and our politics has gotten in the way of that.
Well, and it's the symbolism thing, but it's also I have been trained to go into the political realm for myself.
Right.
And so if my team is against abortion and we get a win, I don't care about the effects of it. I care that my team won and that helps me. And I mean, it works across issues, but the abortion one is unique in that a lot of the people engaging in that issue, it doesn't personally affect them what the laws of abortion are, either because they're a man or because they just aren't seeking an abortion. They're a woman, but that's not something that's happening right now. And so the only way that it can be a personal, how do I get something good out of the political system, is to associate myself with a team and fight for that team to win. But if we were going in with not just an idea of the effects over the symbolism, but also an idea of the community impact over myself. How am I fighting for a more flourishing, just community, and not just for the things that help me or the things that are good for me? Then not only would I have to care more about impacts than symbolism, but even the times when I cared about symbolism, it would be more like, how does my country's laws show all of the things that we care about? Like, how do the laws acknowledge systemic racism? How do they acknowledge our history? How do they show the things that we communally desire and think are good and just, instead of just like, how do I as an individual, or as an individual that's part of a team, go in and fight for the things that are good for me? But like, unlearning that should be so easy for Christians, and yet it's like so deeply ingrained that we don't have an ability to understand that like everything else in our life, our engagement in politics is not about us. It's about the common good. It's about the glory of God. It's about our witness, but we don't do that very well.
Yeah. I made a comment once on the podcast that just on a local political level, if we're voting in ways that make our kids' schools better, but our neighbors' kids' schools worse, I'm not sure that's biblical. And I got called out on Twitter for that, as a socialist. So by Christians. So it's like, wow, how do we have some like deprogramming to do,
Yeah.
but I don't know how you do it. All right, we got to wrap up. Last word, Skye.
Last word, keep your eye on Texas, but don't think that this is like some definitive blow to Roe v. Wade, or this is a turning point in the abortion issue in America. I think that's rhetoric coming from people who either don't know what they're talking about or know what they're talking about and are simply utilizing this story to make political points and stick it to the libs.
Okay. Last word, Kaitlyn.
Just if you really want to have a life-affirming ethic, think about national policies, think about state policies. But I think one way to unlearn this fighting for my team, any win for us is a good win, even if it doesn't practically solve anything, is to say, how do I be life-affirming in my very local community? Like, am I engaged with the local community center or with a clinic that doesn't provide abortions but gives really helpful reproductive care to women, especially from marginalized communities? How am I engaging with laws that are very local? Like, how can I unlearn that warlike, team-like mentality when it comes to politics by just meeting people in my community and seeking to be life-affirming in all sorts of different ways?
That was excellent. Jason?
Okay,
Cinnamon
so
roll?
this ties back the two first stories.
Yeah.
I was thinking, what if the guy with the ladybug in his colon was a spy from China, and that's why he was bugged?
He's bugged.
Yes. He was trying to see how much we were playing video games.
Yes.
Wow.
And there is, we've been like swarmed in our area with these little, they look like ladybugs, but they're not. They're an invasive species. They're Asian beetles.
It's true.
Asian beetles. They
Haven't
look like
Asians
ladybugs.
suffered enough
It's all
discriminatory rhetoric in the
Oh,
last couple of years.
Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry. Oh, no.
That's terrible.
I've been
That's
bad.
terrible.
Sorry. I apologize to everyone for everything. Okay. Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon. Skye has a fantastic guest now, probably the best we've ever had, right, Skye?
Absolutely.
Okay. And Kaitlyn, have a great week at school, and we'll talk to you again next week, and we'll talk to all you again next week. Thanks, guys.
Back on episode 433, I interviewed Bonnie Christian about the troubling statistics from the war on drugs and why legalization might be a smarter policy. Well, today we're revisiting that topic, but from a slightly different angle. My guest is Christina Dent, the founder and president of End It for Good. She'll tell us her story of going from a Southern Christian woman who had no interest in the drug war to becoming an advocate for drug legalization after seeing how many lives were destroyed unnecessarily by our punitive policy toward drugs. This is obviously a very complicated social, legal, and moral question, but I think Christina has some important questions to ask and some challenging ideas for all of us who follow Christ to consider. Here is my conversation with Christina Dent. Christina Dent, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thanks so much for having me, Skye. I'm really excited to be here.
Okay, so I first encountered you through a TEDx talk that you gave about the war on drugs, but it began with your own story. And I'd love for other people to hear some of your story because you don't strike me as the typical vessel of communicating an anti-war on drugs kind of message. So share a little bit about your background and how you got into this topic.
Yeah, so I'm born and raised in Mississippi. I've lived here my whole life. Grew up in a wonderful Christian home, politically conservative family. I was homeschooled kindergarten through high school. Never used drugs during that time. That was not part of my experience. I went to a Christian liberal arts college. I got a degree in Bible. Was also not using drugs while I was there. And I just had no interest in drug use or really anything having to do with drugs. That seemed totally unrelated to my life and my world. And then my husband and I became foster parents. And that was really the first time that this issue came close to me. So I met a woman named Joanne, and she had been using drugs while she was pregnant, not a healthy thing to do at all. But her son was removed from her custody because of her prenatal drug use. And he was brought to our home, and we became his foster parents straight from the hospital after he was born. I didn't know anything about addiction, didn't know anything about why would a mother who loved her child not be able to overcome an addiction while she was pregnant. That I have no category for that in my mind. And so I met Joanne at the local child welfare office for her first visit with Beckham. And I took his car seat out of my car, turned around in the parking lot, and there's this woman sprinting across the parking lot. She is weeping. She comes running over to me and starts kissing Beckham. This is Joanne, my first meeting with her. And she has her 1 hour of visitation time with him. She leaves for inpatient drug treatment. And the whole time, I feel incredibly suspicious. This is not what I'm expecting. This isn't what I think about people who use drugs and struggle with addiction. Certainly not mothers who would use drugs while they were pregnant. And it really challenged me. And I tried to find lots of ways that I was different from Joanne. And when she left for inpatient drug treatment, she would call me from treatment and say, "Can you put me on speakerphone?" And she would sing to Beckham over the phone. And it just tore my heart out, because the more I got to know Joanne, the more I realized she is a mom like me. She loves her son just as much as I love my 3 sons. Her struggle with addiction is not a lack of love. It's not a lack of desire to be free. It's not a lack of faith. She was a believer, struggling through a difficult, long struggle with addiction. And yet, here was a mom who I could clearly see now is like me, which left me with some really difficult things to work through, because I knew that we were also putting women just like Joanne in prison every day. And I really started to wrestle with, what does that mean if we are trying to come alongside vulnerable families? What does this mean for me as a foster parent who is in this to care for vulnerable kids? How can I care for them? I began to see that really caring for vulnerable kids is, we have to extend that to then, why are they vulnerable, and caring for the reasons that make them vulnerable.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about, is it Joanne or Joanna?
Joanne, no A.
Joanna. Yeah, okay. Her story is an interesting one because, thankfully she was seeking treatment. She was in a treatment center, and you mentioned other women, other mothers face a more punitive and criminal engagement where they're locked up for their drug use. Why did Joanne end up in treatment rather than prison, whereas other mothers end up in prison rather than in treatment? What is it about our policies that determine why someone goes in one direction versus another?
A lot of it just has to do with sort of who gets caught and who doesn't. And a lot of that, if you get into that a little further, has to do with, where do you live? What kind of resources do you have? Do you know people who maybe could help you get out of a charge or not? Do you live in a neighborhood that tends to be more police? Do you look like the kind of person who would be using drugs while they were pregnant, and sort of there's some suspicion there around you already? So there's another mother named Nikki who she was also using drugs while she was pregnant. She had relapsed halfway through her pregnancy, had been sober for 7 years prior to that, working full-time, parenting her kids. She was pregnant, got a troubling potential diagnosis for her baby as part of a sonogram, but halfway through her pregnancy, that triggered some anxiety that went back into misuse of prescription drugs to manage that. And she was arrested for that. Very similar. I think they're good stories because they're very similar types of women. They're both white women in their 30s, kind of middle class families. But Nikki is arrested. She's prosecuted. She actually just got out of prison last week after 3.5 years in prison. So her mom has been raising her kids while she's been in prison. She's been in prison 2.5, 3 hours away. And she's just coming back, trying to rebuild and reconnect with children who have been without their mom, who was a parenting good mom for 3.5 years. And so we have to grapple with this, because what we want to say is Nikki was a bad person, Joanne is a good person, and that's the difference. And in reality, the core reasons why people use substances are all very similar to each other. And I think that's what we miss. We focused so much on the drugs and sort of demonizing the drugs. We have failed to recognize drugs are just they're an outcome. I've heard somebody kind of liken it to, it's trying to sort of fight drugs to get rid of drug use and addiction is kind of like trying to stop OCD, like hand washing, by banning different kinds of soap. Like, it's not about the soap. It's about what drives that behavior. And very similarly with drug use and addiction, those are outworkings of what that drug is doing for that person. So part of the reason why this developed for me into such a passion was because of my care for vulnerable kids and for reducing the amount of trauma that happens to children in their childhood, because we know now that childhood trauma is an indicator risk factor for all sorts of negative outcomes later in life. Everything from health outcomes, you're more likely to, get cancer and heart disease. You're also more likely to have trouble showing up for work. You're more likely to be a victim of domestic violence. All these really harmful outcomes happen with the more trauma a child experiences. They're at higher risk for that. So it's the same thing when you look at drug use. If you have, yeah, go ahead.
No, finish your thought, please, on the drug use with kids.
So if you have, there's these things called adverse childhood experiences, which is basically the traumatic things that can happen to you. It can be your parents getting divorced. It can be being sexually abused, growing up in an unsafe neighborhood. If you have an ACE score of 5 or higher, you are 7 to 10 times more likely to use illegal drugs, to inject illegal drugs, to report being addicted to drugs. So we can see the curve is just this really clear line that the more trauma a child experiences, the more risk factor they have for drug use. And that's not because harmed children are bad children. It's because harmed children are hurting children. And when they grow up and find substances that help them numb all of that pain, it's a lot of people end up doing that. Some people do it with substances. Some people do it with, the things you and I might have more trouble with, Netflix or Facebook or, all the different kinds of things, food that we use to sort of numb. So we're really hurting the most vulnerable people, the people who in many cases have already been hurt by other people, not of their own choosing when they were children, are at most risk for then to be met again with the trauma of arrest, incarceration, and kind of the destruction of their lives and families.
Yeah. So what you're arguing, and both from your experience and I think what the data backs up, is that any child that has a parent who's addicted to drugs is facing some level of trauma in their home. But the system we've created to deal with it actually makes the trauma even worse when we criminalize that parent, when we remove the child completely from their life. So no one's arguing here that these substances are a good thing or that they're not traumatic for families and children. It's the way we're choosing to deal with it compounds the trauma. Okay, let me ask you this, though, because I think there's been a growing awareness in recent years that the war on drugs hasn't worked very well. And we've seen a lot of that focused on the legalization of marijuana around the country, the decriminalization of marijuana. One of the arguments that has been made, and you make this even in your presentation, in your TEDx presentation regarding the parallels to prohibition, that when you make substances illegal, you actually create a black market, you make substances more potent, and it becomes more destructive. A lot of attention, though, has been given over the last couple of years to the opioid epidemic. And although there are certainly illegal opioid substances that many people get addicted to, for a lot of people, the gateway into it are legal prescription regulated opioid drugs. So would eliminating the legalization by making drugs legal, are we really solving this problem, or are we just changing the nature of the problem?
So that's a really good question, because it's a good example of the complexity of what we're dealing with. And what humans like to do is simplify anything we can. It helps us not use as much brain power. And that's what we've done with drugs.
Sure.
We've kind of said A plus B equals C. Drugs are bad. Let's make them illegal. Then we can be done with it. And in reality, that hasn't worked. And we have all of these other harms, including what's happening with the opioid crisis. So yes, there was overprescribing of opioids. That is not happening really anymore. We have cracked down significantly on opioid prescribing. Their opioid prescriptions are lower now than they were when we began cracking down on them. And yet what we have seen as a result of that is a astronomical increase in overdose deaths. So if you look at the curves of prescriptions and overdose deaths, what you see is, as you crack down on prescriptions, more and more people die. And that's because when there's fewer legal regulated drugs that are available, the underground market comes in and is happily supplying as many people as want drugs with their versions, which are going to be more potent. They're going to be contaminated with what we have now, which is a lot of fentanyl contamination. And you have more and more people dying. They're not dying from the drugs themselves, per se. They're dying from the unregulated nature of those drugs. Let me tell you a story about that, because a lot of people have heard now about fentanyl. A lot of people are scared about fentanyl because we have more and more teenagers that are dying just using drugs at a party, and they got something that was laced with fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. It can be manufactured in factories where it is, and it's a lot more potent than heroin or morphine or anything like that, which makes it great for smuggling, because you can smuggle even less fentanyl than you ever needed to smuggle of heroin. And that's what the underground market you were talking about does. It's always trying to find more potent ways to smuggle things, because then you need a big punch in a small package. So my youngest son is 7 now. When he was 4, which is the beginning of this kind of fentanyl epidemic, kind of the beginning of my work, he smashed his finger in a door, and we had to go to the emergency room. And we took him in, and he's crying. It took off the top of his finger. So it's like a significant thing for a 4-year-old. And the nurse comes in, and she says, she's got a little syringe, and she's smiling, and she says, hey, I'm so sorry this happened to you. I'm going to give him a little bit of fentanyl, and that's going to help with the pain. And so she gives him this fentanyl. Now, on the one hand, we have all of these news stories about people dying of fentanyl, grown men dying of fentanyl poisoning. And yet, here's a nurse giving a 4-year-old fentanyl. How does that work? Well, it's the difference between regulated fentanyl, where you know the dosage and you know the person who's taking it, and you can give them the proper amount to help with pain management, versus unregulated fentanyl on the street being used by people who have no idea what they're getting. And it is a Russian roulette of, is this going to get me high? Is it going to kill me? There's no way for people to know. So there's this tension there between there can be problems with legal opioids. A lot of that, there's other factors that were part of that too. When you get a bottle of 50 pills from a prescription, that's a little different than, for people that are going to get marijuana from a dispensary. They're only buying, as much as they particularly need for, the next couple days or whatever. So there can be problems with legal drugs. There's problems with legal alcohol as well. And yet, when you make it illegal, when you make it harder to get legally, the underground market is always there. They are always providing what people want. And we have to keep coming back to, why do people become addicted? They don't become addicted because they get exposed to a drug, even a legal opioid. I had abdominal surgery during kind of the height of this opioid crisis. I got sent home with a bottle of 50 Percocet. Well, I took like 3 of them, and that was all I needed. And that was the end of it. I flushed the rest of them down the toilet. I don't have a lot of the risk factors for developing an addiction. There's a lot for all the people who have become addicted. There's millions of people who haven't. And we have to go back to, why do people become addicted? Why is it that something that can be helpful to decrease pain becomes something that ends up being something that they become dependent on, something that becomes a destructive force in their life? And that goes back to, what is it doing for them?
Right. So let's talk about that a little bit more. I suspect I'm a bit older than you are, but we probably are both old enough to remember the early stages of the war on drugs, and particularly Nancy Reagan's campaign in the 1980s, Just Say No.
Oh yeah.
There was this understanding that you couldn't just criminalize drugs or lock up everybody dealing them or using them. You had to cut off the demand. You had to somehow deal with the fact that there's an enormous growing demand for these destructive drugs among the US population. And I suspect whether or not these substances remain legal or illegal, there's still that demand issue. And there's a lot of interest. And we talked to Bonnie Christian last year on episode 433. We talked about Portugal and some other countries that have legalized these substances and the impact it's had. But at the end of the day, if we don't deal with the question of demand, are we just kind of nibbling around the edges of the issue here? And how do we end up dealing with the demand issue? I mean, a lot of people would argue we as a society are sick. The rates of depression, hopelessness that lead people to self-medicate with alcohol, food, drugs, Netflix, whatever it might be. That's really the issue here. It's not that we've criminalized these substances, is that we've created such a sick society that we've spiked demand for them in the first place.
Yeah, there's a lot of things we have to reckon with. And I think, Skye, you're hitting on what people don't want to deal with, which is, it's easier to demonize what people are using to numb all of the pain in their lives than it is to reckon with the pain in their lives. And for us as a society to reckon with the kind of culture we're creating that is leading us to be the highest consumer of opioids in the world, having some of the highest rates of addiction, the highest overdose rates in the world. This is a problem that is very difficult to deal with. It is a problem, I think, that is where the church can come in and provide a community for people who are lonely, and hope for people who feel hopeless. And so much of the recovery journey for people out of addiction has to do with finding a community where they are loved, cared for, where they belong, where they can be truly and deeply seen and known. I don't think we have done a great job of that often in our churches, and it's an area for us to grow and to shine, because you're absolutely right. There is no way that you can diminish supply for something if there is demand for it. I mean, supply always finds way. So if people want to buy heroin, somebody's going to be willing to sell them heroin, whether or not they get that in some sort of legal way or some sort of illegal way. It's going to be a lot more harmful. They're going to be a lot more likely to die if they get it on the streets. But if they want it, it's always going to be there. Drugs are readily available everywhere, in every town in America. And so for us to begin to deal with the drivers of the demand for addiction, it's easier to focus our attention on supply. We just keep cracking down, keep taking those drugs off the streets. And it helps us to kind of feel like we're doing something, instead of reckoning with the fact that that's not decreasing demand. And I would say it's actually increasing demand, because it is creating cycles of trauma in families and communities that are either heavily policed for drug-related crimes, or all of these families who are losing loved ones, all these parents whose children are dying of overdoses, or children whose parents are dying of overdoses. So many of these are preventable. 82% of people who died of an opioid overdose in 2020 had fentanyl in their systems. These are not people who they don't have to die. They could still be alive if we handled drug use in a different way, where they weren't going to the streets to get contaminated substances. So this use of trauma which is the criminal justice system. It's designed to be traumatic. It's designed to be punitive. This use of that trauma to try to deal with an issue that is made worse by trauma, I think we're going to look back on this in another 50 years, and our grandchildren are going to be saying, how could you perpetuate that system for so long when it hurt so many people?
Right.
And the people it hurt were often the most vulnerable among you. That's what I want us to stop. I want us to see this value of life.
There's an assumption. Yeah, there's an assumption that by making something illegal and putting laws in place that severely punish people for engaging it, that you will create a deterrent. And I think we have enough time under our belts at this now. We realize it's not working. The deterrent isn't effective. I mean, the story you started with is a great example of that. If you have a mother who desperately loves her newborn child to the point of running across a parking lot in tears to embrace him, that bond is so strong, and yet the chemical addiction remains stronger. A law passed in some state capital or Washington, D.C. isn't going to make any difference, right? It's so clear that this is a powerful chemical addiction and health issue that laws alone can't break it. Here's the analogy that comes to my mind as you mentioned illegal versus illegal. It feels a little bit to me, and this is going to upset some people, it feels a little bit to me like the immigration issue, in that there's one side politically that says we just need to build a wall. We need to put a barrier up and punish anybody who comes in illegally and send them back. And if we do that, it'll stop the influx of people, especially those coming from Central America. And then there's the more progressive liberal side that says, no, we should have open borders, more or less. We just need to care for them better once they're here. But neither one of those solutions is dealing with the demand. It's not dealing with the fact that so many of the people in recent years who've been coming through the southern border are fleeing from Central American countries that are facing horrible violence and persecution. And if you don't deal with the demand, a wall isn't going to make a difference, and just changing internal policies aren't going to make a difference. You have to deal with the source of the issue. And that's where I kind of get hung up on what I've been hearing from the left and right about drugs is, I mean, I can envision a scenario in which, let's say we do legalize all these drugs. Let's say we put in place treatment and we somehow come up with a compassionate form of distribution to people who are addicted. Fast forward 20, 30, 40 years, how much of our society is just nursing an enormously growing population of people who are addicted to drugs because we still haven't dealt with the demand issue? So I agree with you. I think the punitive approach does more harm than good, but I'm unconvinced that merely making things legal is a solution either. It's not as bad as the current system. I agree with that. But what are we doing to stop the demand? And how do we prevent 50 years from now becoming a society of despair and depression and hopelessness where, heaven forbid, twice as many people are addicted to these things? Maybe fewer are dying because it's regulated. But are we really a healthier society?
I think that's a great question. So I see it as both. So we need to simultaneously be building the kind of world where people don't want to numb themselves, and stopping all of this extra harm that's happening, that's actually creating more of their desire to want to numb themselves because of how much it impacts our daily lives and our world. And I think, so if you look at how many people are using drugs now, to go back to whether or not it has worked, I'm not sure people realize just how many people are using illegal drugs. So right now in the US, 1 in 10 people are using illegal drugs recently. That's the number from the US drug control policy group. Like, this is the federal, their job is kind of enforcing prohibition. This is their number. This isn't a number out of some reform group somewhere. 1 in 10 people. So think about going to the grocery store. 1 in 10 people. You're at a concert. 1 in 10 people. This is widespread.
Oh, at a concert, usage. It's way more than 1 in 10
probably,
people.
I was just thinking that when I said that. Let's go to church. In church, you've got a lot of people sitting in your pews that are using something. They might just be using marijuana. A lot of people are using substances. And so talking about immigration too, you think about, I love what you said there, because I think this is part of what I think about related to that issue, which is, why are they fleeing? Well, they're fleeing a lot of different things. 2 of the major things they're fleeing are violence from cartels down there. How are cartels funded? They're funded through
Right.
drug prohibition. That's what we're doing. We're not fighting crime by enforcing drug prohibition. We are funding it. Mexican cartels make $20 billion a year off of drugs that they sell to U.S. consumers. So we're funding all of this violence that's happening in Central and South America that's largely driven by cartels. Political corruption. Why is that happening? Well, because cartels have so much money that they have been able to basically buy off whole governments in some cases. And so you have all of this corruption. What's causing that? Well, drug prohibition is providing the funds needed to be able to infiltrate the government and get whatever you want. So we have to start doing what you're saying. We got to start tracking back to what is the cause of these things. It's not, now I'm an American, I love America, but it isn't that people just are happy in their homes in Central and South America and say, you know what, I'm going to take this really dangerous trip to try to cross the U.S. border. Why are they so desperate that they're willing to do that? And we have control over some of those things. Our drug demand and our unwillingness to meet that by illegal means is outsourcing a lot of the violence from that underground drug market into other countries that are not as able to deal with that violence as we are. But we're outsourcing it too to our inner cities where the underground drug market plays out on their streets every day. And that violence is preventable. We don't see that violence from alcohol. You don't see one liquor store owner shooting up another liquor store. It just doesn't happen in legal markets like that.
Yeah.
That's preventable. We can do something about that. Those people do not have to die that are dying today.
So part of the argument, and I know there's often parallels made between alcohol or other substances which can certainly be addictive and damaging, but there's a case to be made that, let's say, alcohol is a good example. It also, how do I put it nicely? There can be a social good to the use of alcohol, right? It can be an enjoyable, non-threatening substance when engaged appropriately. The same thing could be said for many opioids, like as your son experienced. There is a medical purpose for this drug when regulated and used properly, which brings good, even though it carries the potential for great danger. There are some substances, however, which that's not the case. You can't argue that there's any kind of medical benefit or social good to meth or to crack cocaine or to some other substances. And some people recoil at the thought of legalizing those substances and creating markets and businesses, or even having the government involved in the creation and distribution of substances which are inherently damaging to people. It isn't like you go out for an evening and have a glass of wine. Oh yeah, I'll take some crack cocaine with that. Thank you very much. Just to top off my evening. Right? That's not the kind of substances we're talking about. So what argument do you give to people to say, yeah, there are some substances which are just destructive and evil and no one should ever use it for any reason. Nonetheless, we should make them legal and create a free market enterprise around them. Like, make the case that that's the right moral position to have.
So I would say, if you look at alcohol is trickier because it does have, we experience it as most people using non-problematically. A lot of us have experienced the use of alcohol in positive ways. But if you look at something like tobacco, look at smoking, well, people would say, hey, I like to smoke with my friends. And yet we know, like, health-wise, it's a disaster and it kills a couple 100,000 people every year. There's no health positive to smoking, and yet we allow people to access cigarettes. Now, we have significantly decreased the amount of people who smoke. We haven't done that through criminalizing it. We've done it through honest education, through making it less socially acceptable, through incentivizing people. If you don't smoke, you get better health insurance rates. There's all these different ways that we put incentives into people's lives for or against different kinds of behaviors. And if we criminalized cigarettes, we would have a massive underground black market in cigarettes. Like, that just would be the case.
True.
We'd have people killing people over cigarettes. We would have cartels taking up the cause of, manufacturing and distributing cigarettes. So I look at it more as substances aren't just legal or illegal because there's good from them. I look at it a little more pragmatically on, is it harming more people to criminalize them than to allow legal access to them? So I think a lot of people do have this kind of moral conundrum over this issue. I feel like I'm somehow supporting drug use by saying, okay, I think these should be legal. And I would say, no, not at all. I don't want people to smoke cigarettes, but I'm also not campaigning to make them criminal. That's just not the right way to handle the harms of cigarette smoking. I would say the same thing here. And I think there's a moral case to be made. And this is why I'm passionate enough about this is what I do full time, is that I think there's a stronger moral case to be made for, can we bear the moral weight of what's happening because of criminalizing drugs, particularly what's happening to vulnerable people? Can we bear the weight of what we're outsourcing to other countries in terms of the violence from an underground market? Can we bear the moral weight of all of these tens of thousands of people dying of preventable overdoses? Can we bear the moral weight of several million people a year being arrested, incarcerated, because they possessed a drug, not because they were, engaging even in the underground market, but just for drug possession? Those have real costs in the lives of people. Real people are dying because of that. As somebody who believes deeply in the sanctity of human life, I feel a moral weight that our policies are creating so much destruction of life. And for me, I'm not around drug use at all. I don't want people using drugs. I don't drink alcohol. I just don't like the taste of it. The whole thing is just like, it's not my thing. And yet, we have to be engaged on what's happening because of what we're doing. And I absolutely can go home at night to my 3 boys. My oldest will be 13 in the fall, and tell them I do this kind of work because I care about people. I care about children. I care about families. I don't want you guys using these drugs. This isn't about that drug use is okay. This is about how do we handle people, and drug policy is people policy. And I absolutely can sleep well at night, knowing that I'm advocating for caring for people in a way that allows them better access to treatment if they have a problem, and decreases the amount of trauma that we are proactively causing in people's lives. And as a Christian, for me, I think that's where I lean on what kind of policy should we have. We should have a policy that decreases harm to people.
I think the evidence backs you up completely. So you don't have to convince me. But let me ask you this as we wrap up. You mentioned you're from Mississippi. You're still in Mississippi. I'm assuming that you spend most of your time talking to folks in Mississippi, which is sort of the reddest of red states, and very church and very traditional in its values. What are the most common objections you're hearing that you need to address as you try to advocate for a different form of drug policy in the country? Because I'm assuming that what you hear there, if you can come up with really good answers to folks in Mississippi and convince them, you can probably convince anyone in the country that your perspective is the right one. So what do you identify as the biggest barriers in the audiences that you engage?
For most people, it is this moral question, feeling like we're losing moral ground. And a lot of people already feel like we're losing so much moral ground. They don't want to risk that we might be losing some more moral ground. And I would say we're gaining moral ground. By ending the drug war, we are making moral gains in the way that we handle people, particularly vulnerable people. And we would have really a different kind of world without the levels of crime and violence that are being perpetuated and the levels of death and incarceration. So for me, answering that moral question with asking them how, can we bear that moral weight? A lot of people feel like, good Christians should support the drug war. Like, this is sort of, we're holding the line, we're holding people accountable. We don't want people using these substances. And I just think we have to grapple with, there's more at stake there. This isn't about whether or not we want people using substances. This is about whether or not these policies actually help people, whether or not they're good for people, whether or not they help us have more strong families and safe communities, whether or not they help more people stay alive. And so I think this kind of visceral reaction of good Christians don't support legalization or moral people don't support it. And I think for a lot of people, they just don't understand what's actually happening. I had no idea that we were causing all of this violence, that we were causing all of these overdoses and all this incarceration. Like, I had never put that together before I started learning. And really, Joanne was the beginning of that journey for me, of digging in and saying, what's actually causing the harm? And are there things that we could do differently? But this is what I have been convinced of. So you can see this kind of shift gaining momentum nationwide. So we have 19 states now that have legal marijuana for adult use. And 8 of those states have happened in the last 9 months. Like, the trajectory shift on marijuana legalization has picked up tremendous speed. And you mentioned that in your interview with Bonnie Christian, of just how much this is shifting. And it's shifting also in conservative states. So there was polling just done in Mississippi on marijuana legalization, and something like 55% of Mississippians believe that marijuana should be legal for adult use. Now, no one would ever think that. If you go talk to Mississippians in a public space, you're not going to hear that. And what I found is that what people privately believe is very different from what they publicly say. I often tell people, if everyone that believed we should end the drug war would stand up at the same time and say so, it would end today, because politicians largely know it. Leaders largely know it. Many pastors largely know it. And yet there is such a tremendous concern over, do constituents know it? Does my congregation understand this? And that's why I think it's so important for just regular people to be open about that there might be rethinking this issue, because that's how change happens. It doesn't happen just by sort of quietly changing your mind and waiting to vote, which is kind of what my husband likes to do. He's like, look, I'm ready to vote, but I'm just not going to be out there talking about this with people. And yeah, for those of us that feel passionately about it, that want to see the change happen faster, helping bring it into public discourse is the best way that we can help that change come about, because there is a great deal of knowledge that what we're doing isn't working and people have changed their minds. And yet we still need to create the spaces for them to say that in a public kind of way, which is a lot of what we do at End It for Good, which is the nonprofit that I started. And we host discussions all over Mississippi. We've hosted over 1,000 people at discussions from north to south Mississippi. And we hear the same thing over and over. A lot of people rethinking, and a lot of people looking for opportunities to be able to kind of say that out loud.
I appreciate what you're doing, because it feels like on a number of different divisive issues, Christians are being pulled in 2 directions. There's sort of the principled position, and then there's the pragmatic position. So, for example, when it comes to abortion, immigration, as we already mentioned, drug addiction, the principled position a lot of Christians want to take is, well, just make it illegal, right? Make abortion illegal, put up a wall at the border, and make drug addiction, criminalize it. And that's the principled position, because those things are wrong and evil and we should stop them. And yet when you look at the actual evidence, does making those things illegal actually result in the outcome that we want, right? Or are there steps that we can take to actually reduce the demand to cross the southern border, reduce the demand for abortions, reduce the demand for illicit drugs, and help people with addictions? And that calls us to a more nuanced and pragmatic way of thinking about it, rather than just, well, I checked the box, that should be illegal. And that's what you're doing. And I appreciate the fact that it's rooted not in politics. It's rooted in genuine care for people and human dignity and the belief that every life matters. So as we wrap up, we'll make sure that we put a link to your organization, enditforgood.com, in our show notes, where people can find out more about what you're doing and engage some resources that you have. But Christina Dent, thank you for sharing and for being an advocate for this, an unexpected advocate for this. I think that's exactly the kind of folks we need talking about it. So appreciate your time today.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me. I would just encourage people to, if they're kind of new to the topic and are still feeling uncomfortable about it, come join us, enditforgood.com/get started. There's just some easy ways to kind of learn more, but I really encourage people to lean in. We are not in a neutral position on drug policy right now. There is a massive cost daily to that. And if we need to be well informed, no matter how we end up on this, and, a lot of my family disagrees with where I've landed. That's okay. We can still be friends. We can still love each other. I want to have respectful discourse on this, but we need to be sure that we're not doing something just because we made a decision 20 years ago, or we grew up hearing a certain thing and we haven't kind of rethought that. I love your example of this kind of principled position. As I started thinking about, okay, but bad things should be illegal. Even if you think about the 10 commandments, only 2 of them are illegal. And Christians aren't lobbying for the other 8 to be illegal. There's a lot more nuance there than just bad equals illegal and good equals legal. There's a lot of legal things I don't want my kids doing either. Adultery or that's they're not going to be put in jail for that, but that's wrong.
Right.
So really, I want people to lean in, because there are people like Joanne and Nikki that are being sentenced in courtrooms every day. Some of them going to treatment, some of them going to prison, and we can be a voice for them, and we can help them get better health outcomes. So we would love for people to come join us on social media, End It for Good MS, or you can follow me at Christina B. Dent across platforms. Come take the journey with us. Come learn. You might end up at a different place. That's okay. But we can find ways to better promote life and health and safety and really flourishing in our communities. That's what we want to do.
Well, thanks for helping us to begin to learn just in the time we've had today on the show. So thanks for being here. Thank you all for listening. You can get more information at enditforgood.com, and we'll see you next week.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Skye Pilot Media, that's Skye's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/holypost. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.